My name is Jeff. I am the founder and managing partner of Ophelos Advisory Group. Ophelos Advisory Group has two primary business lines. We are an executive search firm, so we partner with our clients to help them find hard-to-find talent that they couldn't otherwise find on their own, which is the business model of most executive search firms. Right. So what I do in the course of my job is I work with a corporate partner, and they say, Jeff, we need to hire a managing director. We've been searching for months and we haven't found anyone. Can you help us identify someone? And I say, certainly, of course. And then I use, my network, my pipeline, my Rolodex of contacts, and my research skills, and I go out to market and I present that opportunity to those individuals and try to solicit their interest in having a conversation with my client. And then if everything goes smoothly, at the end of that process, one of the candidates I put forward will wind up accepting a position with that company. And then that's where the negotiation process comes in, right? They have to negotiate things like their starting salary package, or their title, or how many vacation days they'll receive, or any number of things, right? And then in the course of that work, when I'm building new relationships with my corporate partners, they want to come to me and they say, okay, Jeff, we like you. You sound like you know what you're talking about. What are your terms, right? And then that's where my negotiation begins. Like, well, these are my terms, and they say, well, that we don't agree to that. And I said, well, okay, let's, how can we come together in this way, right? So that's how I work in recruitment. And then additionally, I also provide executive coaching services to professionals who are looking to get a job, right? So maybe they've been, looking for a job on their own. Maybe they've been unemployed, or maybe they're employed, but they're unhappy in their current job and they're looking to leave, and they haven't been able to come up with a successful strategy to do that. So I can work with them and educate them and, show them perspective they might not otherwise have, to help them understand where the blocks are in them achieving their goals. So that's my background. I've been doing this work for 15 years, right? And it's enjoyable. I like it. I think it's important. I think there's a need for this type of support for people out there in the world. And, I'm pleased to, be able to show up in the community in this way. So obviously negotiation is a big piece of every aspect of my business. And someone told me once upon a time, many years ago, that a person needs to feel that they've been able to say no 3 times before they feel comfortable saying yes. And this was kind of the topic of conversation that got Jonah and I started, because I saw a post that she had posted on LinkedIn about what are your favorite negotiation techniques, or what do you feel is useful, or something along those lines. And I shared this observation, and she said, wow, that sounds interesting. We'd love to see how that plays out in practice. So, there's a couple of reasons behind this. There's some very interesting psychology behind it, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. But I always say to people that the first step to getting what you want in a negotiation is frankly knowing what you want. And it sounds a little silly to say it. You're like, well, of course, that's obvious, right? But it's not always. A lot of times in my personal experience and what I've seen from the candidates that I coach is they haven't really taken the time to define for themselves the thing that it is they want. They know they want something. They know they want something more than what they have currently. But what exactly that is, or to what extent it will satisfy their needs, hasn't been really defined. So then what happens is we enter a negotiation without a clear objective or a clear direction in mind. And when that's the case, our default position as a party to the negotiation is to get as much as we can, right? I'm not sure what it is exactly I'm looking for. I just know I want to get as much as I can. Um, and that's a dangerous position to be in, because what that does is it makes us appear greedy or piggish to our counterparties, right? It demonstrates that we don't respect our counterparties' positions or their needs, and it leads to negotiation in bad faith. And ultimately, that's not where we want to be. It can ruin your deal entirely, right? So that everybody walks away empty-handed, or sometimes even worse than that, it creates a situation where I would say, you win the battle, but you lose the war, right? Because a lot of times our negotiations, in fact, bind us to our counterparties, right? They are the first step in a process that binds us to our counterparty. So if the party that we're dealing with feels like they've lost or they've been taken advantage of, then we still have to live with that person after the fact, right? And that's not a good way to enter into a relationship or build a relationship or build trust, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're negotiating for business purposes, right, we want to be able to service this client for a long time to come. We want them to be comfortable working with us for many years, to give us as much business as we're able to handle, and we don't want them to come to the end of the terms of our arrangement and say, I had a bad experience with Jeff. I don't want to work with him again because he really took advantage of us in this situation.
Feel you naughty.
I'm sorry?
Feel you.
Oh,
It's
hi,
feel
Phil.
bad.
Hi. Yes. So the knowing what we want going in is the first and the most important element of how to begin a negotiation. And then once we've established that, prior to actually beginning the negotiation, we need to establish three things, right? So the first thing we want to establish is what's our reach goal, or what's our stretch goal, right? What is the best outcome that we could reasonably hope to achieve, right? If I'm coming into a negotiation and I know that my skill set might demand a salary of anywhere between 200,000 to 300,000, right? Then my reach goal would be 300,000. It wouldn't be $10 million. Like, I wouldn't come to the conversation understanding, kind of the value of my skill set and then ask for a ridiculous number like $10 million. So you have to have a reasonable understanding of the value that you're looking to receive. So if we say $200,000 to $300,000, then in that scenario, $300,000, that would be my stretch goal, right? That's the best possible outcome that I could hope to achieve. And then from that position, we set our fallback positions, right? Where I say, okay, if I need to show flexibility, right? I know there's a strong possibility I might not walk away with the most possible. But what is acceptable to me, right? What, in the best of all scenarios, if I can't get the most, then where would I fall back to in a way that says I could be reasonably happy with this, maybe even more than reasonably happy. I could be excited about this, right? So maybe for me, in that scenario, we'll say maybe it's $250,000, right? So 300 is my stretch goal. And as we start the negotiation, my fallback position, is set at $250,000. And then we have, that bottom limit, right? The non-negotiable, what's sometimes referred to as your walk away number, right? What's the lowest possible figure that I could be offered that meets the barest minimum of my expectations, right? To the extent that if I needed to, I could accept it, but anything less than that is not worth my time or attention, and I'm prepared to walk away. Right? So whenever I'm working with candidates and I'm counseling them on salary negotiations, or whenever I'm working with companies and I'm also counseling them on salary negotiations, my recommendation going into these conversations is set those limits, right? Identify your reach target, identify your fallback position, and then identify your breaking point so that you know where you're coming from. So does anyone have any questions on this much so far? Is this making sense to you? Is it consistent with what you all discuss in your conversations in the club?
You'll be amazed at what they discuss in the club.
I'd be curious to know a little more. Okay.
You don't want to. Question for you a little bit.
Yeah.
When it comes to, like, your walk away, nice to have in your whichever ones they are. As a genuine question, how many individuals go in it with clear numbers as to what they're trying to achieve?
That's a great question. So I would say, and I can only speak to the people that I represent in those negotiations as a recruiter, right? But anecdotally, very few, right? So, and this is, I think you joined us shortly after I began the conversation, but what I was explaining to the cohort was the first step to getting what you want is to define what you want. Because when we don't define what we want, the expectation we come to the table, we just want as much as we can get, which puts us in a weak position from a negotiation standpoint, and can also make us appear piggish or greedy or unreasonable to our counterparty, because they might put forth an offer that's very generous. And if to use to kind of build on the example I set, let's say my reach goal was 300,000, right? Or let's say the upper end of my skill set was 300,000. Well, if my counterparty comes to the table and says, Jeff, we'd like to offer you 300,000, if I don't have an understanding of what my objective is, then I'm going to push back and say, well, I want $350,000, right? And then my counterparty, it will see me as negotiating in bad faith, because they'll say, well, wait a minute, the value that you deliver is only worth a maximum of $300,000, and to ask us for more than that makes us feel like you don't respect our position or that you're trying to take advantage of us. So to your point, very few people that I've encountered, usually when I'm working with people and we get to an offer stage where we're negotiating compensation, I have to initiate this conversation, right? They don't really know. They just like, well, how much are they offering, or what do you think? So it's good to know going in. And then here's another, just one more thing I would add on that. Sometimes negotiation, and I certainly don't want to undermine the, kind of the ethos of the spirit of your club here. Sometimes it's not necessary, right? And that's the point. If I come to a table and my reach goal is 300,000, and my counterparty says we'd like to offer you 300,000, that's an opportunity for me to say, thank you very much, I accept, right? We don't necessarily have to say like, oh, well, they offered me, that's their first offer, so I must push for more. And I know certainly there are people out there who take that approach, but for me personally, it's not an approach I would recommend. And I would say going into the situation, knowing what it is your objective is to get your objective, right? Not necessarily to push beyond that. And additionally, I'll add a final thought to that. Sometimes, you're familiar with the phrase, be careful what you wish for, right? Because if I go in and I say, oh, I want 300,000, and they say, we'd like to offer you 500,000, initially you might think, wow, I really lucked out. I got a whole lot of extra, right? But the reality is, when there's that big of a gap between what we can the most we can reasonably expect and what's offered above that, be cautious there, because a lot of times that's a way to obscure the fact that there are strings attached that you may not be comfortable accepting. Right? So did I answer your question, Philip?
Yeah, you have. I think Romina wants to ask a question. I've got two more, but I'm going to defer to Romina. She's more senior in the club than I am.
Okay, cool. Romina, fire away.
So I have a question. You say you've been in the recruiting world for quite some time, and let's talk about the range. Let's say I want to get a job, and I think my range for my skills is 100 to 200. But you've been in the profession for quite some time, and you're like, no, your skills are actually 200 to 300 range. So how do you help? So you're going to play the betweener to help them get the higher salary, let's say. But how do you help the actual person, process it in their mind that they're actually worth more? Because sometimes if you feel like your work is worth less, you don't really go as hard towards negotiation. You would just be like, oh, 200, that's like my top range. So how do you also talk to the other party? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, so how do I talk to the company, or how do I talk to...
Let's say you're trying to help me find a job, and I think my skills are worth 100, 200, but you're like, no, they're worth up to 300. So how do you prepare me to not be like, oh my God, like I got 200? Yes. Just say yes right away when that actually might have been the lowest offer on their end.
Right. So that's a great question. I think the conversation begins with each individual, right? So if we were working together in that regard, Romina, I would have a conversation with you, and I'd say, look, what are your expectations around compensation? And you might say, like, well, anywhere from 100 to 200 would be great for me. Mm-hmm. And I would say, okay, based on my experience and my understanding of what my client is willing to pay, I think that we have some flexibility to go beyond that. I've seen people with your skill set in this market, command salaries up to $300,000. And I can't guarantee you that my client will be forthcoming with an offer in that range, but I want you to have all the information that you need so that we can make an informed decision together. So based on that knowledge, like, what is your objective? And again, this goes back around to my initial point, because again, it's, it really comes down to the party who is looking to obtain the outcome, right? If you say to me, Jeff, I would be perfectly happy with 200,000, then great. That's your happiness, right? And there's always the potential in some regard that if you push beyond your comfort level, in any negotiation, there's always a risk of loss, to a certain extent. Right. So would you feel comfortable asking for 250 when you would accept 200 if you knew that the request for 250 would reject you, would eliminate you from consideration? It's, when I work with people, I really think it's important for them to be in the driver's seat, right? I'm never, ever going to say to someone, I can definitely get you 300,000, right? And then they're going to say, well, I would have taken 2, but that's great. Let's go with that. And then we get to the end of the line and someone says like, well, we don't think Romina's worth more than 225. We're going to go look at other candidates, right? I would not feel good about that. I would feel that I had failed in my, in my responsibility to you to be an effective advocate on your behalf. If you would be satisfied, with the range that you gave. So again, that's why I always recommend going in. Let's talk. Let's talk about kind of what your objectives are and agree together on a strategy to set those reach goals. Because maybe we'd say, okay, well, Romina, maybe, I think that your skill set, commands quite a bit more than that. Why don't we make your reach goal 250, and then 225 can be your fallback, and then 200 is your walk away number, right? Is that a strategy that you would be happy with? And if that works for you, then great, we proceed in that manner. Did I answer your question?
No, that did. And the fact that you say you talk to the client before, like, let's say you and me would sit down and have a full-on conversation about this, I think that's important. And I feel like sometimes we tend to forget the prior conversations before entering as a team in negotiation. So no, that did answer it. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic.
I have also, oh, sorry.
Yep. Yes.
Jonah, am I okay?
Yeah, no, you go, it's fine.
So what, Kingsley, I love the way he always smiles at me. It's like, Phil, he's at it again, bastard, what's he doing? A couple of things, okay? I was speaking to some legal students who has got a placement with a solicitors, all right? He's come out of university, he's now got a placement, he's on a training contract, okay? That marketplace is saturated. I mean, there are law students coming out of everybody's ears, okay? So it's really, really difficult for them to differentiate themselves. So if you're in that situation, and what he was saying is actually a lot of the law firms know they're in a really strong position. They know that it's not that they just don't even pay them, but if you haven't got the qualifications or you're not prepared to get the qualifications, you're not in there. Do you recommend negotiating at that level?
It's a good question. So in this particular instance, there's a very particular set of circumstances in play. So if we're talking about the global legal community, right? In the big law firms, right? Schulte, Roth and Zabel, Linkletters, Davis Polk, Weil Gotshal. There are a number of law firms that are recognized globally as being elite, right? Those law firms typically work together to set compensation best practices, right? Because what they don't want
that sounds a little bit like a cartel.
A little bit, but it actually winds up working to the advantage of the candidates, because they don't want to create an environment where attorneys are constantly changing firms for $1 more an hour, right? So they'll say, okay, look, a first-year associate coming out of law school here in the U.S., right? We'll pay that person a starting salary of, I haven't checked it recently. I think it's probably somewhere around $160,000, $180,000 US, right? And then in their second year post-qualification, they'll raise that up to 220, and then in the third year they'll raise it up to 280 or whatever. So it follows a scale. But in a broader sense, you're asking if the market is saturated for a particular skill set, or at a junior level, is it worth negotiating? And I think the answer is always yes, to a certain extent, right? So first comes the awareness that there is a saturation at what's being offered, right? But everybody still wants their first choice, right? Nobody is ever satisfied given their second choice. They want their first choice if they can get it. And specifically, if we're talking about the process of employment, of hiring, of recruiting, that's a very time-intensive process, and it's very labor-intensive. And to get to the end of that process and identify an individual that you are excited about hiring into your organization, like the preference for everyone is to move ahead with the person we chose, not to just go to default to who's ever next. So you may have a little wiggle room. What I recommend in those situations, and there's a phrase that I find to be very effective, you know, you come sincerely and politely to the company and you say, listen, you know, I'm very grateful to have received your offer. I'm very excited about the possibility of working here. I do feel I have an obligation to myself and to my family to be the best possible advocate that I can be for myself. Am I to understand correctly that this is the most that you are prepared to offer? Right. And then the trick of it then is you have to be comfortable sitting in silence until they answer you. Because if there's any hesitation on their part whatsoever, there's at least a little something on the table, right? So if I were to ask that question, and I would say, if this is my understanding correct, that this is the most you're prepared to offer, if they were to say, well, it's like, okay, great. Now I know there's a little more, right? You know, just a little bit. So they'd say like, well, you know, this is what we feel comfortable with, and, you know, we hope that you'll accept it. And you could say, okay, great, you know, thank you. Would it be possible for me to ask for an additional $5,000 that's consistent with where my objectives were? I'm very excited to come on board, you know, staying positive, polite. And then, you know, if they like you and, you know, and you ask politely, you might get someone to say like, yeah, okay, you know, we can do an extra $5,000. But there has to be an awareness around the ask and what the market will bear. And to my original point, if they come back immediately and say, no, Jeff, this is the most that we can offer you, then you say, okay, great, thank you. I was just checking, right? You know, but there has to be some, you know, if you ask politely, I think it would be unusual for anyone to say, we're so offended that you even made the request, we're rescinding our offer. And frankly, if someone did take that position, you're probably better off not having taken that job anyways. Cool.
I always think it's quite interesting that when negotiation is part of the skill sets that you're looking to employ, that people that you try to negotiate with them. And I'd be saying, look, if you screw me over, I'm employing you.
Well, right. Well, there's that too, right? Because, you know, in my line of work, you know, previously when I was starting in my career, a lot of my work was sales and business development. And I've certainly helped to place people who worked in sales and business development. And you don't want to hire a salesperson who can't negotiate on their own behalf. Like, that's not going to be a good look, you know? So it's totally okay to you know, to ask for a little more. Cool. Any other questions before we move things along?
Quick one from me, please.
Okay.
I'm stuck at the second point. Maybe, yeah, the second point, the fallback position.
Yes.
Now, there's a position when you leave with a loss, or
no.
That's a walkaway position, right?
The walkaway position is the one where, you know, and again, it's you know, it can be, you can frame it any number of ways, right? If you're coming to a salary negotiation or a contract negotiation for a business, or a real estate transaction of buying a house, right, or selling a house, or you know, any number of divorce, right? We're getting divorced. We're trying to figure out how we split up our assets, you know, whatever. there's the most that you can possibly hope to achieve, right, or hope to acquire. And then your fallback position, however you define it, is kind of the point where you can say to yourself, I would be really satisfied with this outcome. Maybe it's not the absolute most I could have gotten, but it's still an outcome that I would be happy to accept, right? And then your walk away is that bottom threshold where you say to yourself, this is not my ideal, but if the circumstances warrant, I could accept it if I needed to, right? So here's a great example of how that might play out, right? If I'm unemployed, right? If I had previously worked as a vice president for a company and I was paid, $200,000, right? So let's say I've been unemployed for the last 6 months, right? So my reach goal might be $250,000. If I was still employed, like I would be looking for an increase, right? Maybe that's the most I could hope to receive. My fallback then might be 225. It's not the most, but I'd still be really happy with that. And then my walk away is 200, because I would say to myself, that's exactly the same amount of money I was making before I lost my job. And it's better than nothing, so I'll take it if I need to. But it's not an offer that I would be particularly excited to accept, but I will. And then, obviously, moving forward, then you would have to determine, is it worth your time to remain in that situation? Or is it a temporary measure that, kind of addresses some needs you have while you look for something else? And, that's kind of goes back to the other thing with your counterparty, right? And not really putting the irons to your counterparty, because if I'm the company in that position and I'm extending an offer to you, right, I don't want to offer you the bare minimum that you'll accept and then keep looking for a job that pays you what you want, right? I want you to accept an offer that you're happy and excited to accept. And then I know that you'll be loyal to my firm and you'll do good work, and there's potential for you to advance within our organization and all of those things. Trying to really get one over on someone is not a technique that I personally recommend.
Kingsley, did you hear that?
I'll try to remember that one. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so the original question that prompted the invitation was the idea that we say no 3 times to something before we say yes. And there are a couple things going on here today. There's a concept that you can research called negativity bias, right? And what that means simply is that people will, by and large, work towards an objective for the avoidance of pain or discomfort rather than towards a reward, right? So I may not necessarily be motivated to reach for the brass ring, but I will be definitely motivated to avoid being punished, right? It's the old cliches, the carrot or the stick, right? Most people are motivated by the stick, not the carrot, right? They just don't want to experience that level of pain or discomfort. So when you're in a conversation with a counterparty and you're in a negotiation, we understand that the act of saying no to someone is, in some regards, kind of punitive, right? It's hard, it's, blunt, it's uncomfortable, and people don't like to do it. If you've ever had to deliver bad news to someone, tell them something they don't want to hear. If you've ever had to reject someone, to break up with someone, to fire somebody, you'll recognize that it is an extraordinarily uncomfortable position to be in. And most people do not want to be there in that place any longer than they have to. But what's happening psychologically when you tell someone no in a negotiation is the same thing that's happening psychologically when you tell them no because you're breaking up with them, or because you're firing them, or because you're telling them that they can't have the thing that they want. It makes the person who's saying no very uncomfortable. So if we're going into a conversation, a negotiation, we can leverage that to our advantage if we're prepared for it going in ahead of time. And I know, Jonah mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that she has children. And if any of you else have children or have been around children, you'll know that children understand this concept instinctually, right? You know, my boys, when they were very young, would come to me and they'd say, hey, Dad, can I have, I'd say no. And they'd say, Dad, please, can I have it? I'd say no. And they'd say, Dad, can I please have a piece of cake? Please, please, please. I'd say, okay, fine, right? There's an idea that they wear you down eventually. Now, obviously, when we're negotiating, we're adults and we're negotiating with other adults, but the principle is the same and it still applies, right? Whatever the thing it is, if my kids were asking me for a piece of cake, right, then, substitute for a piece of cake, whatever it is, the thing that you're looking for, and you have an idea of the concept. And, and then normally in that interaction with my children, it would go like, I would get to the end and I'd say, okay, no, fine, you can have a piece of cake, but you have to clean up your room first. Right? Okay, great. And that's negotiation. That's how it works, right? So when we get into this scenario, how do we position ourselves to say no, or to allow the counterparty to say no enough times so that they feel that they've done right by themselves, and are prepared to, come together on terms. Right? Well, it comes down to, what are you negotiating? Because in almost every negotiation, we're negotiating multiple terms at any given time, right? So if we are, for example, negotiating a business contract, I might be negotiating on deliverables. I might be negotiating on pricing. I might be negotiating on guarantee periods. If I'm negotiating a job offer, I might be negotiating on salary. I might be negotiating vacation time, benefits, bonus compensation. What will my title be? Those are all things, all points of negotiation. If I'm negotiating a divorce, I might be negotiating spousal support payments. I might be negotiating child custody terms. I might be negotiating how we separate our assets, all these things. So the ideal here is to identify the terms that are nice to have, right? You're nice to have, but they're not your deal breakers, right? Similar to the original concept, what are your stretch goals? What's your fallback position? And what's your walk away? So if I were to come to my boss and negotiate a promotion and say, hey boss, I've done real good work this year. I think I deserve a promotion. I'm looking for a $20,000 promotion. I want you to have a basket of fresh fruit on my desk every Friday. And I want you to pay for a car service to drive me home at the end of every day, right? My boss would say, well, hey, listen, Jeff, I can't give you a $20,000 increase. That's just not in our budget. And say, okay, great. Well, can I trust that you'll come through with the car service and the fruit basket? And they'll say, like, well, I can't justify the car service. That's not on the table right now. And I say, well, what about the fruit basket? And they'll say, well, okay, like you can have the fruit basket, right? So I walk away with something. But the trick of it is to position the things that you're giving up as the things that are most important, when you know that the thing that is most important is the one that you're holding in reserve, right? So the things that you put on the chopping block, right, which is, you know, that old term, the stuff you put on the chopping block first is the stuff you can stand to lose, right? The stuff that you don't mind so much. When I was negotiating contracts, you know, with corporate enterprise clients, right, the term that everyone always looked at the closest was our pricing structure, right? They always wanted to negotiate on price. So I would set my initial ask at the high end of my ask, right? The very, very most that I could hope to receive. But the reality is the term that was most important to me was the refund policy. Because in our industry, when something doesn't work out, it's oftentimes pretty common for a company, a recruiting firm, to be obligated to return money, right? And the most important thing for me was not to ever have to give money back, right? To make sure that I got to keep the money I earned, and if there was some solution available to make the client happy without having to refund money, that's what I wanted to go with. So an extra couple $1,000s here or there was not a deal breaker for me to concede, as long as I got the thing that I wanted, which said, never will I ever have to refund anyone any money. Right? So in your negotiations, what do those things look like for you? What are the things that, you know, you can put on the table as concessions to demonstrate that you are negotiating in good faith? Because, like we said, people don't feel comfortable saying no more than a handful of times, especially if they haven't conceded anything on their own, right? It's like, if I come to you and it's just no, 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 well, then I start to feel that, you know, maybe I'm not negotiating in good faith, and maybe I should make some concessions as well. So that's an approach that's always worked really well for me. And I've had quite a lot of success with it. And I've had a lot of success on behalf of my clients with that approach as well. Any questions?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
So what are you all negotiating? I love, like, are you business professional? Do you work in sales? Are you attorneys?
Kingsley is probably the only professional here. The rest of us are all amateurs.
Good to know.
Yeah, I wouldn't take him seriously. Coca-Cola. So from my perspective, I just wanted to thank you first and foremost for such a fantastic overview of your experience, and also that knowledge that you have about negotiating. And I think what you touched on is really fascinating in terms of that concept of those candidates that you're coaching, you're helping to get them jobs. And I suppose the level that they're at, they may come in with preconceived ideas about their abilities, their behavior, based on their experience and the jobs that they've held. But that ability to help them to develop their negotiation skills is something that really, I guess, excites me. And so it's really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's interesting. I think, you know, the previous notions of negotiation, especially if we look back to like the 1980s of like the hard charging, you know, kind of corporate raider, you know, take no prisoners, winner take all. You know, those notions are, you know, thankfully, I think, dying out, right? You know, the best value I can offer you when it comes to negotiation is that you will do the best for yourself if you are able to get your counterparty to put themselves in your shoes, right? And that's my final fallback position to any negotiation, right? If I'm at a point where there's something on the table that's very important to me, then my close on that to my counterparty is always, listen, this is important to me, right? And I hear where you're coming from, but these are my reasons. And if you were in my position, what would you do? Right? And it's a really effective way to turn the tables, because it makes the other person stop and say like, oh, well, yeah, okay. You know, I can see that from where you're coming from, right? It's not a guarantee, right? I mean, nothing is ever a guarantee in this life. But it's your last stand to really have an opportunity to affect a positive outcome in your benefit. And if you're negotiating with a party who values you as a service provider or a salesperson or whomever, right? If this is a counterparty that you are going to maintain a relationship with beyond the end of the negotiation, it is a worthwhile tactic to use.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
A very quick one again. A very quick one again, please.
Sure.
I'm a bit not confused, but a little bit in doubt. When we negotiate, we have a time frame to negotiate, be it on the spot, at the minute that you talk with someone, be it in a week time or whatsoever. So my question is, in terms of timing, will the 3 no's work before you say the fourth, before you get the 4th yes? Because timing, yes, right. You don't want the variables. You are not bothered about the,
Absolutely.
Not bothered about.
You're absolutely correct.
I'm time for PA, for example. So timing is the utmost thing that I can offer.
Yeah.
Not save lives. So that's the game changer for me. I offer time for people by taking off chores, not chores in terms of merely chores, but tasks or whatsoever. So that's my service. But it's for any business, I assume, because the deal has to be closed within a time frame.
So there is this concept in negotiation, right, that speaks to that point, and it says sometimes we can leverage urgency to create an outcome to our advantage. And I would say to anyone, to you or anyone, that is a tool at your disposal, right? This offer goes off the table in exactly 5, midnight tonight, and then you're like, oh, okay, great, that's what we refer to sometimes as a high pressure sales tactic. And it speaks to my original point that I would consider that to be a bad faith negotiation tactic. You might be able to leverage someone into taking an action, that satisfies your interests. But if you need to maintain a relationship with these individuals beyond the terms of the negotiation, you run the risk of really damaging your long-term relationship. And there's a phrase that we often used in recruiting, but it applies to anything really. Nobody likes to negotiate with a gun to their head, right? So you might get the thing that you want, but there's going to be a cost that comes along with it. And if you're okay paying that cost, then go ahead and use that tactic, right? Because it can be very effective, right? Typically, the longer these conversations draw out, the less likely they are to resolve themselves in a way that people are satisfied with. So there needs to be some urgency to the process, but use what we call exploding offers. Use them with caution.